Hello and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is James Perloff. Perloff has been a guest before on the show talking about a previous book. He is on today to talk about a new book, and I will let James introduce himself and tell listeners who aren't familiar with him who he is, and then we'll get into why he is here. So, welcome, James.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. Well, I also want to introduce any of my followers to you, but as far as myself, I've been awake since 1978 when I read Ned Derry Color Conspiracy by Gary Allen, and I've been a writer for alternative media since '86 when I started writing for the New American magazine, and my first book was The Shadows of Power in '88. And I've also written a couple of books on creation versus evolution. Um, I've written a summary of the New World Order about 10 years ago called Truth is a Lonely Warrior. That's supplemented by another book called 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. I wrote a book that was an Amazon bestseller, but I won't mention it because it's one of those things you're not supposed to talk about. They eventually censored it and had to do my own printing. 2 years ago, you and I talked about a book I had on Orthodox Christianity called Missing Saints, Missing Miracles. And the book we're going to be talking about today is about the Lincoln assassination. It's called Exploiting the Official Myths of the Lincoln Assassination. So I'm basically an alt media person. And I just want to say, Rebecca, I'm very comfortable being on with you for a couple of reasons. Number one, we both came to Orthodox Christianity the same year, 2017. And it's not all the time. Actually, it was not too long ago on a podcast with a fellow Orthodox Christian. But it's really nice to be on with one. The other thing about you is you're a real Dixie girl, and you can relate to what I'm saying in this book in the way that most podcast hosts probably wouldn't. And by the way, I read a little bit about you, and I wanted to ask you, I understand you're a descendant of A.P. Hill, General A.P. Hill. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And I read something about a ring related to Hill. Um, am I wrong? There's something about a ring
A
that
missing ring?
no, a ring that you have that somehow relates to Hill, but
Ah! Yes, it's just a picture of him. I don't have the ring on now. I used to always wear it during podcasts, but it's kind of large and it would get hung on things, and I'm always trying to be relaxed during my interviews. So I stopped wearing it for the interviews, but yes, I do have a ring.
yeah, it's my understanding that you're an ex-Virginian.
Hmm.
You're now a Carolina girl. Now,
Hmm.
my understanding also is that April Hill's statue was the last one to be torn down or removed in Richmond.
Hmm.
Did political correctness taken over in Virginia have anything to do with your move, or was it unrelated?
It was unrelated. I had gone to school in Wisconsin, actually,
Hmm.
and then I met a Carolina boy when I was living in Wisconsin and fell in love with him. And that's what actually brought me back. I'd moved to Colorado after I graduated college and worked in Colorado Springs for a bit. So who knows if I hadn't met who is now my now husband, this lovely human who brought me
Hmm.
back to the East Coast. But my story is a long one. I'll say when I came back, I was still a liberal. And then 2001, the World Trade Center thing kind of joggled my mind. And then I went on that long march from liberal to neocon to radical individualist libertarian. Then I started thinking about how radical individualism can't be everything. And then I really tapped back into Southern history, and that kind of helped me connect the dots because knowing history is extremely important. It's real history, not the
Right.
official narrative. So that just opened up a whole world of who I am, where I'm from, what my identity is. And it was actually history that opened the door to orthodoxy for me. A lot of Fordhamites will say, oh, people coming through history and blah, blah, blah. It was just a stepping stone because as a former Protestant, well, I'd been an atheist, then a former Protestant, I thought Protestantism, was the beginning of Christianity. Like it all started in 1517 or whatever. So
Hmm.
once I realized, wow, there's all this history from the time of Christ up until the Protestant Reformation. So yeah, it was a long road to get where I'm at. And I'm always learning, which is one of the reasons I really loved your book because I knew the basics of the official narrative. I knew a couple of the quote unquote conspiracies, but this book is really an eye opener with and you don't just provide answers, sometimes you do. You help connect the dots, but you just ask good questions that may remain unanswered, but the point is they're unanswered and why are they still unanswered after all this time, you know? It's pretty crazy. So I loved this book. It was an extremely it was a packed read and it's short. It's I mean, gosh, it's less than 200 pages. So I hope that everybody gets it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, actually started out, I was going to write a blog post, and the reason was that I was looking to what I should write as my next blog post. And back in the 90s, I was studying the war between the states at great length. I read a lot of memoirs, diaries, papers, etc. And it culminated with my writing an article about the war between the states, southern part of this magazine, actually. But there's one book that I read by Otto Eisenschimmel called Why Was Lincoln Murdered? And it just blew me away. The man's level of scholarship was astonishing. The people he talked to, the archives he went into, the rare memoirs he found, in a non-digital age when there's no internet, the legwork this man did was just amazing. And the conclusions he drew blew apart the mainstream narrative. So I started to write this blog post. You know, I'm going to bring this generation the knowledge of Eisenschimmel's work, right? Then I found Eisenschimmel wrote a second book in 1940 called In the Shadow of Lincoln's Death, and that book was excellent. And then I started looking for, has anybody followed up on his work, you know, before I write this blog post? So I found, you know, I read a number of books, conspiracy books and otherwise, about Lincoln's death, and nothing was really hitting home runs for me. And then I found a Virginian named Don Thomas, and I just want to hold up this man's books. Don Thomas, his ancestors were also Confederates. They fought defending Richmond. And so I got in touch with him and I said, you know, Don, I noticed you never referenced Otto Eisenschimmel. Is there something you didn't like about the guy? He said, no, I never read Otto Eisenschimmel. I was amazed because Don Thomas, like Eisenschimmel, went into the archives, did all this research, and basically reached the same conclusion without even referencing Eisenschimmel. And so Don and I have become very good friends, and we've had at least 50 phone conversations and quite a few emails, and he directed me to many important resources. Now it's possible to find digital information that Eisenschimmel had to go into library special collections to find. You can find it digitally now and search it. So the blog post kept getting longer and longer, and so finally I said, you know what?
I've never done that.
Nobody wants to read a long blog post. So I figured it's got to be a book, but it's going to be a relatively short book. But it has to be a book. If I've admitted to a blog post, just collect dust on the internet. So I proceeded, and as my eyes opened, I realized that what's going on in the South now, where they tear down statues like of your ancestor, A.P. Hill, and they banned the Confederate flag. That's destroying history. And they've done the same thing with Lincoln's assassination. You know, the truth is uncovered almost 100 years ago. And Eisenschimmel's book was actually a selection of the Book of the Month Club. I mean, it was getting around. And I talked about this in my book, but I found in 1971, NBC television aired a special a documentary on Lincoln's death that made the same points as Eisenschimmel, and we'll be talking about these tonight. The things we're talking about tonight were once common vernacular amongst many Americans, but it's been wiped out. And so my goal has been to try and bring this information back to public attention, because the modern historians are trying to join forces with the same people who are melting down the statue of Robert E. Lee. And I don't want that to happen. I want to see people come back to what people had discovered about the truth about Lincoln's assassination. So usually the way I like to start out is by recounting the mainstream narrative that most people know, just to refresh people, because, you know, Kennedy's assassination has had a lot of attention in recent years, but most people don't think too much about Lincoln. So the mainstream narrative would be this: April the 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox to General Grant, which effectively ends the Civil War, even though not all Confederates have surrendered yet. By the way, I learned as Sensor wrote the book that Robert E. Lee said he deeply regretted surrender at Appomattox after he saw what happened to the South afterwards. It said we would have fought to the death if he knew it was going to happen.
Yes.
Anyway, back to the mainstream account. 5 days after the surrender, President Abraham Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. with his wife to attend a play. Now, General Grant was supposed to attend with Lincoln, but
Right.
he was a late cancellation, so Lincoln had to find a substitute, and he wound up inviting acquaintances of the family, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancee, Clara Harris, who were, she was a daughter of a New York senator. And they sat in the presidential box with Lincoln's. Well, about 10:15 p.m., third act of the play, John Wilkes Booth, famous actor and Southern sympathizer, comes into the presidential box, shoots Lincoln in the back of the head, render him unconscious, mortally wounding him. Now, Major Rathbone actually sprang to his feet and he grappled with Booth, but Booth stabbed him with a Bowie knife so deeply that he broke an artery. And there was a lot of blood in the box. A lot of people thought it was Lincoln's blood. It was not. It was from Major Rathbone. But Booth, he then jumped onto the stage that was below. But Rathbone was still trying to get him. And ironically, on the way down, Booth caught his spur. He was going to get away on a horse. His spur caught in the American flag. He fell so awkwardly that he broke his leg, and yet he stood up and he yelled the state motto, Virginia, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always the tyrants, and the South is avenged. Despite the broken leg, rushed out the door, really before people really fully understood what had occurred, and he rode south. Now, this is a part that a lot of people will have forgotten, is at the same time, a accomplice of Booth named Lewis Powell attempted to assassinate the Secretary of State, William Seward.
Right.
Seward was badly injured from a recent carriage accident, and he was bedridden, but Powell got into the house. He stabbed Seward several times. He was not expected to live, but he did. Now, in the meantime, Booth is riding south. He is really being bothered by this broken leg, and he can't stand the pain any longer. So he diverts off course several miles to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who he knows slightly. Mudd reduces the fracture after taking the boot off. He makes a homemade splint, has a neighbor build crude crutches, and Booth, after resting up, continues on his way. 12 days after the assassination, April the 26th, he's cornered by Union troops in a barn in Virginia. Now, his riding companion, David Harold, surrenders, but Booth refuses to come out. They torch the barn, and although they've been ordered to bring Booth back alive to stand trial, a soldier fires through a crack in the barn, mortally wounding Booth. After this, 8 alleged conspirators are tried by a military court, 4 are hung, and 4 sentenced to hard labor. That would end the story, except for one thing I need to mention, which is part of the mainstream narrative, but is also important to understand the truth. Booth's original plan had not been to kill Lincoln. His original plan was to kidnap him. And on March the 17th of 1865, he and about 7 accomplices were riding on a deserted stretch of road. Lincoln's carriage was supposed to go by. It had been announced he was going to visit a thing called the Soldiers' Hospital or Soldiers' Home. And their plan, it was a pretty elaborate plan, actually. They had the whole thing laid out. They're going to try and seize the president's carriage, bring him south, hold him hostage, hoping to ransom him for the return of Confederate POWs. Sort of a last-ditch effort to save the Confederacy. But Lincoln canceled his travel plans. It didn't work out. And then Booth said, you know what? Maybe we can kidnap him at Ford's Theater. And Booth's companion said, that's ridiculous. We'd never get away with it. And 3 of his friends just dropped out of his plan at that point. That's just but that basically is the mainstream narrative. And as we're going to see, it's full of holes. And what I'd like to do with it is to go through it chronologically. I think it's the most sensible way to do it.
Okay. So, well, the first chapter is the early anomalies in the assassination story. Actually, that's chapter 2. Chapter 1 is the official narrative. So there are many anomalies in the assassination story. One of the most interesting ones that I didn't realize was the bodyguard hubbub. And then I guess I knew that Booth had a Derringer pistol, but that it was a single shot. I probably learned that along the way, but that had forgotten that. So that shows some kind of foreknowledge of his confidence, or the bodyguard not being there. I mean, I don't know if I learned about that. So maybe pick up with some of those anomalies, but especially the bodyguard part and the bodyguard he wanted to get and was refused by a certain someone who we will be talking about.
Yeah, and the person who refused him the bodyguard turns out to be really the major player in
Mhm.
this whole story. All right, so on the day of the assassination, um, General Grant, as we mentioned, canceled out, and the reason he gave Lincoln was that he wanted to visit his family in New Jersey. And it's been pointed out that this really didn't make sense because nothing was going on urgent with the family. Nobody was going to get married the next day, and nobody was sick. Grant could have honored the president's request to go to Ford's Theater and taken the morning train, but instead he took the evening train, and he was on that train when Lincoln was shot. All right. Now, the mainstream always puts a spin on every aspect of this. So the
Mhm.
mainstream spin is that Grant's wife, Julia, didn't get along with Mary Todd Lincoln. So she pressured her husband not to go to the theater that night. That really doesn't make sense because all they're being asked to do is to sit in the presidential box in full view of the public. So it's not going to be a cat fight between these two ladies. That doesn't make any sense. The real reason is that Grant went to the War Department and he spoke to his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And Stanton warned him not to go to Ford's Theater that night. It could be very dangerous. So that's why he canceled his plans. Now, Stanton's plan is quite a contrast to his approach to Lincoln that same day. Now, Lincoln, at about 5:30 in the afternoon, was walking to the White House to the War Department, and he was walking with his bodyguard, William Crook. And I want to quote Crook's memoirs. Quote, I was surprised when later on the afternoon of the 14th, I accompanied Mr. Lincoln on a hurried visit to the War Department. I found that the president was more depressed than I'd ever seen him. His step was unusually slow. Mr. Lincoln said to me, Crook, I believe there are men who want to take my life. Then after a pause, he said, I have no doubt they will do it. The conviction with which he spoke dismayed me. I wanted to protest, but his tone was so calm and sure, I found myself saying it said, why do you think so, Mr. President? Other men have been assassinated, was his reply. All he could say was, I hope you're mistaken, Mr. President. End quote. So Crook stands outside the War Department while President Lincoln goes inside. Lincoln speaks to Stanton. Stanton says it wouldn't be a good idea to go to Ford's Theater, but not with the same conviction he told Grant. And Lincoln says, well, people expected me. It was announced. I need to go. I want a strong bodyguard. I'd like to take your assistant, Major Thomas Eckert. I know how strong he is. I've seen this guy break iron pokers over his arm. And Stanton says, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but we're going to be very busy in the War Department here tonight. I can't possibly spare Major Eckert. Lincoln didn't accept that. He went right up to the desk of Major Eckert, whose job he was in charge of the cipher desk, that is to say, the telegraph desk.
Mhm.
And Lincoln says, Major Eckert, would you be my escort tonight at Ford's Theater? I know how strong you are. And Eckert says, sorry, Mr. President, I have too much of a workload. So Lincoln says, we're getting this from Eckert's assistant, the memoirs of David Homer Bates. Lincoln says, surely, Major, you're working wait for the morning. Eckert says, no, Mr. President, it has to be done tonight. So Lincoln takes it in stride. Now, what you need to know is that Eckert and Stanton are lying. They're not even in the War Department that night. They signed out. Stanton went home, had dinner. You read his account of that evening when he received news of Lincoln's assassination. He was in the War Department. Neither was Eckert. He signed up as desk debates. So they weren't even in the War Department. They were not busy. It's a lie. Now, the mainstream spin, there's always a spin. They say, well, Stanton and Eckert were so concerned with the president's safety, they thought if they didn't give him the bodyguard he wanted, that he'd change his mind about going to Ford's Theater. That doesn't pass muster because Lincoln said right then and there, I'm still going. If that being the case, if they're really concerned, they should have said, in second thought, you could have Major Eckert after all, but they
Right.
didn't. All right. So let's get to that bodyguard now. Who is Lincoln's bodyguard that night? His bodyguard is John F. Parker, a man who has been erased from history. Very hard to find this man in history books. He was a member of the Metropolitan Washington Police, one of 4 police officers assigned to the presidential bodyguard detail by that force. Now, he had a terrible record as a police officer. He'd been charged with misconduct many times for visiting a brothel, pulling a gun when he was there, firing a shot, using foul language, being drunk on duty, being asleep on duty. Somehow he always gets off and he winds up being Lincoln's bodyguard that night. He shows up for work 3 hours late, kind of unusual for someone to keep the president of the United States waiting for 3 hours. I think there's a reason for that, which I talk about in my book. It wasn't just his habitual laziness. Just as unusual for a major in the U.S. Army like Thomas Eckert to refuse a request from the president of the United States. Be my bodyguard? And he says no to the president. Very unusual. Anyway, what you need to know about Thomas, John F. Parker was he started the evening at Ford's Theater as he should, sitting in a chair outside the presidential box. Then he deserted his post. He went next door to the Star Saloon and began boozing it up. He wasn't seen again until 6 o'clock the following morning. Nobody really knows where he was, but he came in at 6 o'clock and in the morning at a Washington police station with a prostitute and charged her with being a lady of the streets. Now, the police, of course, didn't charge her. They're looking for the president's assassins. They don't care about a hooker. Now, some people think he spent the night with that prostitute, and I think there's reason to believe that for several reasons. Number one, he was known to frequent brothels. Number two, there was pandemonium in the street after Lincoln's assassination. There were lynch mobs. They threatened to burn down Ford's Theater. And that atmosphere of anger and distress, very unlikely to a woman of the streets without plying her trade. Plus, he brought her in at 6 o'clock in the morning, which means he must have nabbed her about 5:30. That's pretty late. Usually a hooker would be out around 11 or 12, not 5:30 in the morning. So a lot of reason not to believe even that part of his story. But here's the thing. William Crook was a good bodyguard, the daytime bodyguard, who was relieved by Parker, said this. It's Parker's job to be at the rear of the president's box, quote, fully armed and to permit no unauthorized person to pass. As incredible as it may seem, he quietly deserted his post of duty. It's through this guard's amazing recklessness, to use no stronger words, that Booth accomplished his foul deed, end quote. So what happens to Parker? You'd think that Parker would have been sent to jail, letting the president be murdered. He at least would have lost his job. But no, he doesn't get any jail time. He doesn't lose his job with the Metropolitan Police. He even stays on the presidential bodyguard detail after letting the president be murdered. And when Mary Booth Lincoln saw him at the White House, she said, "You caused my husband's death." And she was right. I know she was a high-tempered woman, but she was right. So there was an investigation of this incident by the Washington police, but the charges were dropped and all the records were lost, as were so many records related to this assassination. And the man in charge of the assassination investigation was none other than Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who denied Lincoln the bodyguard that he wanted just before the incident at Ford's Theater. Now, in case anyone thinks that Stanton was a soft touch, a kindly old man, he signed countless death warrants during the Civil War. There'd be families that their son was court-martialed for falling asleep on guard duty and sentenced to death. Lincoln would sign a reprieve, then Stanton would rip it up. He had no mercy, this man. Yet somehow he lets the president's bodyguard go free, and he's in charge. Now, he's taken charge of a murder investigation that should have been handled by the Justice Department, by the Attorney General, because Booth's a civilian, the president's a civilian. This is not a military matter. But Stanton got away with it. He said, this is obviously a Confederate plot, which it wasn't. He had no proof of that. But he said, it's a Confederate plot, therefore it's an act of war. Therefore it comes under my authority as Secretary of War, and he got away with it. Nobody stood up to him, and he just became an autocrat. He became the real dictator of Washington and the country at that point, because Andrew Johnson, the vice president, was sworn in, but he was new. He had not been Lincoln's vice president the first term. He was a Democrat, actually. They're trying to take votes away from George McClellan in the second presidential election Lincoln had in 1864. But he was just getting his feet wet, and he was not in any position to be a strong ruler. So it's really Stanton that's controlling everything. By the way, interrupt me at any time you have a comment to interject. But for contrast, what I want to point out is what Stanton did to an employee of Ford's Theater named Ned Spangler. Mm-hmm. Spangler was a scene shifter and carpenter. And what he would do is he would shift the scenery while the curtain was down for the next act. That was his job at, main job at Ford's Theater. Now, what was his big crime? Well, his big crime was this. He became one of the eight convicted Booth accomplices. Booth came up before the assassination behind Ford's Theater with a horse, and it was not his own horse. He'd rented it from a stable. And the stable owner named John Pumphrey said, Mr. Booth, this horse is very high-spirited. He could break away on you. And Booth wanted that horse. He wanted to make sure that horse was ready for him. So he sees Spangler, and he says, Spangler, would you hold this horse for me? I need to go into the theater for a couple of minutes. Now, Spangler doesn't know Booth is about to kill the president. There is zero evidence he ever discussed assassinating President Lincoln. He does know Booth, but only on a professional basis. Booth often performed at Ford's Theater. Even President Lincoln saw Booth perform at Ford's Theater. He knew him as an actor. And Spangler didn't hold on to the horse. His time was a waste, and he had to get back inside to shift scenery. So he said to another employee named Joseph Burroughs, hey, Joseph, would you hold this horse for Mr. Booth? He wants someone to hold his horse for him. So that's it. That's his crime. That's been proven that he just held on this horse briefly that Booth had. Now, for that, Stanton orders him to be arrested. He's placed in solitary confinement. He's guarded by 2 soldiers at all times, but he's forbidden to speak to them, and the soldiers forbidden to speak to him. At all times, he's handcuffed. His legs are shackled with an 8-inch chain. These things are biting into his skin. And they place this amazing canvas hood over his head. Now, he can't see. He can barely hear. It has one small hole. You'll see a picture of it in my book, but also you can look it up online. And even at mealtime, that hood doesn't come off. He can't see the food. He's handcuffed. He can't even feed himself. But the guards took pity on him, and so one guard would stand watch while the other fed him. But he had this hood on for weeks until the trial. So did all the others, except for the one woman that they hung, Mary Surratt. She didn't have to wear the hood, but she was manacled. But to be kindly to a woman, they left the hood off of her. But this was a new invention by Stanton. Nobody had ever heard of these hoods before. And this is a violation of the Bill of Rights, which forbids cruel and unusual punishment. A canvas hood constantly over your head, that's cruel and unusual punishment. But as Stanton and the other radical Republicans, we'll see, didn't care about the Constitution and what it said.
Well, I have a question for you. I learned in the book that Stanton had invented this bizarre hood, and then at one point he tweaked it, I guess, to make it even crazier and like pushing on the eyeballs or whatever. But it had not been used in America up until that point, right?
Right.
And then
very
has
crazy
it since
thing.
Then?
As I'm sure you heard, that they once did experiments on soldiers in recent years. Sensory deprivation, if just a few hours would drive you crazy. So can you imagine what it's like having these hoods on for weeks and not be able to speak or talk to anyone during that time. Just an insane psychopathic treatment of these prisoners. Now, at the trial, Spangler was given the latest sentence. He got 6 years at hard labor. The 4 were hung, and the other 3, including Dr. Mudd, for having fixed a splint for Booth, got life at hard labor. Although the sentences were commuted by Andrew Johnson for those still alive. Now, here's a question that you were asking before. How does Booth know he needs a one-shot Derringer to kill the president? And mainstream historians don't seem to want to get into this question. The only weapons he got when he goes to the presidential box are a one-shot Derringer and a knife. How can he be so sure he's going to get the president with 1 bullet? Now, if a competent bodyguard like William Crook had been there, all the bodyguards had 38 Colt revolvers. If Booth had to use that 1 bullet to get rid of the bodyguard, now he's going to have to stab the president to death. But first he'll have to get past Major Rathbone, and then the president's going to be on his feet at that point. Lincoln was 6'4", and he used to be a rail splitter. Booth is 5'8". There's going to be no easy contest for Booth to stab the president. By that time, the box will be full of people, rescuers anyway. So why is he so confident he needs that 1 bullet? Seems he's got some inside information that bodyguard is going to be away from his post. As a matter of fact, both men, Booth and Parker, are in the Star Saloon for the assassination, although we don't know did they speak to each other, etc. But if people don't believe that Booth had inside information, I have positive proof he had inside information. Now, you remember we were saying that Secretary of State Seward was attacked in his home by a Booth accomplice named Lewis Powell, who was stabbed. Now, how did this accomplice get into the home? He pretended to be a pharmacy delivery boy. He said, I'm here from the pharmacy. He had a package with a bottle in. He said, I've come with medication prescribed to Dr. Verity. That was the name of Seward's physician. He knew exactly where the stairs were, knew exactly where the bedroom was. And the servant's trying to hold him back. He's suspicious, but he just pushes the Powell was a big guy, 6'2". He was an old Confederate veteran, and he didn't let anybody get in his way. But how did he know all this information about Seward? It's inside information that only could have come from the government or from inside the Seward household. Booth definitely has inside information that night. And I'm going to move on to the weirdness of Booth's target selections. But first, I'm going to just pause it for a moment in case you have a comment to make.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the attempt against Secretary of State William Seward, and then, of course, we'll get to VP Johnson. I want to talk about that too, but that's going to be the selection of the targets. So just keep going ahead. You're on a roll.
Okay. As you know, Lincoln acted as a dictator, and I didn't see your thing on the Gettysburg Address, but he's talking about the government by the people for the people, shall not perish from the earth, and yet he didn't practice that. He was arresting elected legislators, people elected by the people who disagree with him. He's closing down hundreds of newspapers, acting as a dictator. Habeas Corpus Suspension Act, under which thousands and thousands of people were arrested without warrant, without due process, without a trial. But here's the thing. After the war, as you well know, there was brutal Reconstruction. People already wiped out by this war. Their crops were burned, their homes burned down, Atlanta was burned, Columbus, Richmond was just nothing left but chimneys in many places of the city. And people were in poverty, and the Yankees came down, the carpetbaggers, and they placed ridiculous taxes on these properties. You remember Scarlett O'Hara had to pay the taxes on Terra, so she went to Rhett Butler to try and beg him for the money for the taxes, but that was happening, and they stole billions of bales of cotton, and people couldn't vote for their own governors. They had during the military occupation for 12 years. It was martial law. They were ruled by military governors, not elected people. And Lincoln was against this. He wanted a restored union. He wanted the southern states restored to the Congress. Now, the radical Republicans were upset with that. They said, if the Democrats from the South unite with the Democrats of the North, we're going to be out of power. And so will the deep state, whom we represent, by the way, be out of power. And so Lincoln was against, as bad as he was in so many ways, Lincoln was against recrimination against the South. He thought they'd suffered enough. And in his second inaugural address, he called for malice towards none and charity towards all. These are the last words they wanted to hear. This man had to be removed. And I just want to, in my book, I recount some of the things Southerners said about Lincoln's death. Robert E. Lee condemned it. Jefferson Davis said it will be disastrous for our people. Virginia newspapers called Booth a scoundrel. And back in the 90s, I read a book called The Confederate Girl's Diary by Sarah Morgan Dawson. She lived in New Orleans during those tempestuous times. And that's a 440-page book. I remember these words. I went back to get them. The last words in her book were, "Our Confederacy has gone with one crash, the report of the pistol fired at Lincoln." She knew that the assassination meant the South was going to be punished even worse than had been planned, because they were going to get blamed by Stanton and the radical Republicans for Lincoln's death. But somehow Booth doesn't know that. And there was only one other prominent man in the administration who joined with Lincoln in saying there should be a gentle reconciliation with the South: Seward. Why does Booth attack the only two men who stand in the way of the brutal Reconstruction, and the others are left alone? Now, they claim that Stanton and Grant and Johnson, they were after them too. I have a chapter in my book called Other Alleged Botched Assassinations. I put it to my readers that the only assassination attempts were the ones that took place. Seward and Lincoln They were the ones they wanted to get out of the way.
And didn't
Bo-
Stanton at some point say that Jefferson Davis was the organizer of the plot just to kind of hammer home
Oh,
the narrative?
Stanton said that. Stanton,
Yeah.
even at the end of the trial, he introduced perjured evidence against, proven to be by the House committee that
Yeah.
investigated it. It was perjured evidence against Jefferson Davis. Never allowed to defend himself or have counsel there to
Right.
represent him. They just said he was behind it. But they needed that to hang these people and for the Reconstruction.
The
Um,
implication, not just this was a lone lunatic or, some reactive Southern partisan, but that it's the whole South to
Yeah,
blame
it's a
too.
South. The South is the one who was behind Lincoln's assassination. But by comparison to the regret over Lincoln's death in the South, not to say that people loved Lincoln, they didn't.
Right.
Many of them hated him for sure. But listen to what radical Republican Congressman George Julian said in his diary on April the 15th. Now, Lincoln died on April the 15th at 7:22 a.m. That day, the radical Republican Congressman organized a caucus, and here's what um, George Julian wrote in his diary that very day. Lincoln's body is barely cold. Quote, I like the radicalism of the members of this caucus, but not for a long time have I heard so much profanity. It became intolerably disgusting. Their hostility towards Lincoln's policy of conciliation and contempt for his weakness were undisguised. And the universal feeling among radical men here is that his death is a godsend. It really seems so. For among the last acts of his official life was an invitation to some of the chief rebel conspirators, Jefferson Davis, to come to meet in Richmond and confer with us on the subject of peace, end
Mhm.
quote. Radical Republican Congressman George Julian. So it's the radical Republicans who are celebrating after Lincoln's assassination, not Jefferson Davis. Um, and there's more about the forensics of the assassination. But let me stop it there because I know as a Dixie girl, you might have some input for us.
Well, on page 23 of your book, you say in those days, it was the Democrats who were conservative. The radical Republicans were pro-Marxist, pro-totalitarian, excuse me, and readily abused the Constitution. And then you go on to give evidence of that very bold and true statement. And I think it's important that you put that very early in the book because, you know, people think, oh, the Republicans freed the slaves and the whole modern narrative that, it's the Democrats are more racists and all this kind of thing. But you have to understand what was going on back then and the unconstitutional and immoral things that were done during the war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Southerners like myself, we don't like Lincoln. We talk about the war in Lincoln, the war in Lincoln. But to me, having read this book, it was like the nail in the coffin for the narrative we're still living with to this day. And assassination is just a tool of the state and what I would call the Yankee Empire. And I think we're
Mm-hmm.
still living with the ramifications because now, you know, not only did the South live through Reconstruction up until the 1870s, my contention has been Reconstruction never ended. It's
Mm-hmm.
just
Good point.
different. It's more like a velvet handcuff kind of thing now. And of course, Southerners or the archetype, which would be white, straight Christian men, doesn't have to be Southerners, but that also folds into this narrative that they're the forever scapegoat. I mean, Kamala Harris is running on that today. So, the controlled information, the suppression of civil liberties, the secret agendas that are all happening now, well, it was happening back then too. And I've often said if you don't understand 1861 to 1865, you cannot understand why we're at where we're at and how it all came to
Right.
be. And it's not to say that things were perfect before the war, but it was a very Jacksonian, Jeffersonian thing,
Mm-hmm.
with sectionalism, but at the mass scale, what you would call the deep state, this mass scale that is oligarchs and people behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
I just think you do a really good job of explaining that. And I think it will pique modern readers, not just because we are living in clown world, but heck, there was just an assassination attempt on another guy who had been
Right.
president. So
Right.
it's like nothing is new under the sun. And, you know, There are obviously going to be people who may want to know more about the Lincoln assassination and read this book and not agree with your assessments. But I think anybody who is fair and wants to, you know, really think outside of the box about the wealth of evidence you gave, questions unanswered, evidence missing, people changing their stories. Gosh, what happened to his Booth's body? I mean, there's enough smoke there that there's, to me, definitely a fire. So but I really appreciate that you broach the big picture issues on page 23.
And you're right. The reason I put that in there is because people will get confused when they start hearing about Republican conservative. When they think Republican, a lot will think, well, Rand Paul, right? I mean, the Republican Party of the 1860s and the Democrats, it's almost a flip. It was the Republicans who were left wing back then, and it was the Democrats who were conservative, and that flipped over many decades. And that's something people need to grasp. And you're also right about this being that I think it's a great point you make that the Reconstruction never ended. And when I was growing up, there were a lot of movies that would really paint Southerners as rednecks and bigots and really built up dislike for Southerners. Um, you know, um, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mhm.
Um, well done movie, but it's about a black being accused of something that the bigoted whites have really done. Not got the best picture, and then the best picture in I think it was '68, In the Heat of the Night. Kind of along the same scenes was Sidney Poitier's the black detective. I think he's initially accused of a murder, and then he solves it, and it gets the white bigots. And it actually goes back to an earlier movie called Intruder in the Dust, where the rednecks are blaming a black guy for a murder that they've committed. And we kept getting inundated with that, all kind of leading up to the situation we have today, where they're actually won't even allow the Confederate flag. And that, as you say, all the statues being removed systematically and destroying history. So you're right. It is a continuum, and Reconstruction hasn't ended. The hatred of the South and what it stood for, and by that I don't mean slavery, because part of the 1860 census, less than 5% of Southerners owned slaves, so they weren't joining up in the Confederate ranks to defend their ownership of slavery. 95% of them didn't.
Right.
But
And then, if you can erase history, you can control the narrative, right? If people aren't getting all
mm,
the information. And then, you know, these oligarchs, you also say America is run behind the facade of democracy by a wealthy oligarchy that keeps its thumb on both politicians and the press. And, those oligarchs, that facade of democracy, I would say enslaves us all.
right,
And, Black Southerners were suffered under Reconstruction equally among white Southerners. And
right,
then Dr. Don Livingston has done great work about the utter death toll um, of the high percentage of Blacks that lived in the South, just root, hog, or die. And the extinction theory was one of the Union's tools in dealing with the Black problem, right?
right. Yeah. Many blacks, elderly, who are on plantations now. You've got your freedom, but you've got nowhere to go and no way to make a living. There were a lot of blacks who died. A lot of blacks, women, by the way, along with whites, were raped by those occupying forces. Um, so uh, things were grotesque in the wake of the Civil War. Um,
Well,
or
let me
there's a
say
point.
one thing about
Mm,
women real quickly. If you go to Mary Surratt's Wikipedia page, they would say she was the first woman executed by the U.S. government. But
mm,
I
mm,
would think
mm.
the war on civilians, the total war against the Southern population, Black, white, Indian, and everything mixed in between, I would think that many of those were executions as well too. So
That's a marvelous point. I guess we could say Mary was the first official
yeah.
execution. That's a very good point.
And
Um,
she was a Catholic, which I find interesting. I guess I'd known that, but forgotten that as well. And so, well, probably, anti-Catholic bias help played into her
Hmm.
character assassination. And then one last thing, and we'll get back to the book, would be, you know, uh, the scapegoating of the South. The Yankee Empire, the global empire, uses that whenever they're trying to start a new war. They do it to the Russians, they'll do it to the Iranians. They're evil people, they're less than human. I mean, if you can do that to fellow American citizens, it's easier to do it to, Russians or Iranians,
Hmm.
people who live thousands of miles away. It was perfected on white Southerners, then they did it to the Plains Indians to make room for the railroads. And then
Hmm.
this is how the global empire works.
Yeah, they keep manufacturing villains, and an example of that would be Spanish American War.
Mhm.
They had posters showing a Spaniard as an ape, right? Trampling on the American flag and its bloodied hand on the dead sailors on the USS Maine. But when World War One comes around, now you've got posters with Germans as apes crossing the Atlantic with a damsel in distress in their arms and a club over their shoulder, and their posters. It's like, they just keep manufacturing the hatred of the latest victim
Yeah.
of the latest country that you want to bring a war upon. Happens, and this is why, in order to understand events like the war between the states and the Lincoln assassination and our other wars, it's always important to have the full context of history.
Yeah.
And that's something I've been trying to do since the 1980s, is to understand these things and to help people see. I always like to do the comparison of a jigsaw puzzle. If you've got one piece of a jigsaw puzzle, it's just a piece of color. But if you can put the whole jigsaw puzzle together, you see how that piece fits into the entire panorama of historical events.
Do you want to
Well,
talk next about the alleged botched assassinations and why Andrew Johnson? Because he was pretty hardcore for Reconstruction in the beginning, and kind of being vitriolic about it, but then softened it over the years. Correct?
yeah, and well, that almost could fit better into later in the conversation,
Okay.
but there's a very interesting comment that Booth made, when he crossed the Potomac into Virginia. He was actually helped by three Confederate soldiers who found out who he was. Um, and they helped him to the Garrett farm, which is where he was finally cornered and shot. But one of them, named M.B. Ruggles, had an extensive conversation with Booth about the assassination. And Booth said, there never was any intent to kill Johnson. We never had a plan to kill Johnson. He said, there's a famous card he left at Johnson's hotel. Johnson didn't have a home yet in Washington. He was staying at the Kirkwood Hotel. And we still have this card to this day. It still exists, but he left a card in the box at the hotel. He asked, "Is Johnson in?" They said, "No." Could you put this in his box? The card said, "Are you in? Don't wish to disturb you, J. Wilkes Booth." And that card is still around, but
Unreal.
he already knows he's not in. There's
There it
no. Oh
is.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, he doesn't need to write a card like that. Booth told the Confederate soldiers that the purpose of putting that card there was to implicate him,
Okay.
which is exactly what Stanton, the Secretary of War, did during the impeachment trial of Johnson, when Johnson would not go along, stopped going along, I should say, with the Reconstruction plans. And then he tried to fire Stanton. Stanton refused to be fired. He barricaded himself in the War Department behind barricades and sentinels for months while his friends, the radical Republicans, tried to impeach Andrew Johnson, and they missed by one vote, and that was the end of Stanton. But leaving that card there gave Stanton a tool of blackmail. It didn't do Booth any good,
Right.
but it did Stanton a lot of good. And this is I have a final second, my 10th and final chapter. It's called "There's Something About John," where there's a number of steps that Booth took that can't be readily explained, where he implicated certain people, including Johnson. It just didn't make sense for him. If he really decided to kill Lincoln on the day of the assassination, when he found out that Lincoln was going to be at Ford's Theater, why is it that the first thing he does is he goes over there and puts that card at Johnson's hotel? It's a strange story. And if he's unwittingly working for Stanton, who has planted his own feds in his circle, just as the feds infiltrated the so-called insurrection of January the 6th, you start to understand
Yeah.
what's really going on. But why don't we continue on with the forensics of
Okay.
the assassination, because it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, right after the assassination, wouldn't you know, the telegraph wires go down around Washington, quoting the May 2nd New York World. May 2nd, I mean 1865. Within 15 minutes after the murder, the wires were severed entirely around the city, excepting only a secret wire for government uses, which leads to Old Point, which is in Virginia. End quote. Now, who's in charge of the telegraph wires? We didn't know. It's Thomas Eckert, the same guy who refused to be the bodyguard. He told Lincoln that he couldn't be his bodyguard because he's going to be too busy with the telegraph wires that night. Now, I just want to read what he told Congress.
And wasn't Eckert, hadn't he been Stanton's assistant before then?
He was as assistant, but as I'll mention just a minute, he grew in his stature. So Congress, the Congressional House Judiciary Committee was asking him questions in 1867 during the impeachment trial of Johnson. So they said, did you have knowledge of the telegraph lines at about the time of the assassination of President Lincoln? I did. Was there any interruption of the lines that night? Yes, sir. What was it? It was my impression at the time that they were cut, but we got circuit again. Early the next morning, the manager of the commercial office reported the cause had been crossing of the wires of the main batteries. Throwing a ground wire over the main wires would have caused the same trouble, and taking it off would have put them into ordinary working condition, something that obviously Booth didn't know how to do, but Eckert would. Now, they asked him, was there an investigation into what the cause of the difficulty was? No, sir. It did not seem to be sufficiently important, as the interruption only continued about 2 hours. I was so full of business of every character that I could not give it my personal attention. End quote. Now, we could stop right there. First of all, he says it wasn't important because it only lasted 2 hours. Well, it's very important to John Wilkes Booth. It gives him a 2-hour head start before the news of the president's assassination can be telegraphed. It is very important, contrary to what he's saying. He's saying it's no big deal. It's not. It is a big deal. And he says he couldn't handle it because he's too busy. Wait a minute. Where did you hear that before? He told Lincoln, I can't be your bodyguard because I'm too busy tonight handling the telegraph wires. But when the telegraph wires go down, he's too busy to look after them. Then that's possible. I mean, the president's been assassinated. He probably did have other duties. But if you keep reading his investigation his questioning by the House Judiciary Committee, keeps using that excuse, I was too busy to do what you asked me about. Now, regarding his position, his loyalty did pay off. Stanton made him the Assistant Secretary of War. Then after he left the government, he worked for Jay Gould, the robber baron, and then he became, after a meteoric rise in the telegraph industry, he became president and chairman of Western Union. Now, the mainstream historians will probably tell you it's just because he's a hardworking lad,
Yeah.
Worked his way up through no, that's not how it works in the real world. You got to have very powerful people in back you to become president of Western Union. So that's another part of the picture. And then I really find this has been overlooked, but Booth escaped from Washington, D.C. over what's called the Navy Yard Bridge, which got him into Southern Maryland. He has to get over that bridge. If he doesn't get over that bridge, he's going to be stuck in Washington, D.C. And there's lynch mobs already forming. Everybody knows he's done it. He leaped onto that stage in front of more than 1,500 witnesses. Everybody's saying John Wilkes Booth has killed the president. He has to get over that bridge. But there's a curfew in effect. And let me just read the military orders. In effect, quote, no person except general officers will be passed over any of the several crossings over the Potomac River between the hours of 9 p.m. and daylight without the countersign, a password, and a pass. So how did Booth get over the bridge? Now, he must know that there's a curfew. Washington has a 9 o'clock curfew. That order is 2.5 years old. It originated in January of 1863. So it's almost 2.5 years. He has to know from all the time he spends in Washington that there's a 9 o'clock curfew in Washington. You can't cross the bridge after 9. But the assassination is at 10:15. The only information we have about him crossing that bridge is from the sergeant who was in charge of the bridge, named Sergeant Silas Cobb. Now, we don't know Booth's story or David Harold, his writing companion's story, because they were both killed. So the only information from Sergeant Cobb. Now, Sergeant Cobb said this in his official statement. He said that Booth came riding up about 10:25. That's about right. That's about 10 minutes after the assassination. And Cobb says, "Sorry, sir, nobody can cross after 9 o'clock." Booth says, "Well, I didn't know it's a rule like that. I got to get home to my home in Maryland." So Cobb says, "What are you doing out so late?" And Booth says, "Well, I was waiting for the moon to come up because I need to see the roads better." So Cobb says, "Okay, you can go." So Booth crosses the bridge, and then shortly after that, his writing companion, David Harold, comes up. Now, Booth really needs Harold because Harold knows the roads of southern Maryland very well. And Cobb tells Harold, "Sorry, kid." He's only 22, Harold. Um, "Sorry, kid, nobody after 9 o'clock is allowed to pass." And Harold says, "Well, I didn't know the rule like that. I got to get home to Maryland." So Cobb says, "What are you doing out so late, kid?" He says, "Well, you know it is. I had a tryst with a young lady, but I got to get home to Maryland." So Cobb says, "Okay, kid, you can go." That's his story, but that's all we have. Now, there's a couple of things about this. Like I say, if they had to have a guarantee across the to get across that bridge, there's no way that Booth just thought, "Oh, I'll get across the bridge in spite of orders because I can smooth talk my way." He's not going to take that kind of a deal. He has to have a guarantee.
Yeah.
So either Cobb has been tipped off to let these two over the bridge, or Booth and Harold have the password and a pass. I don't know which it is, but they had to have a guarantee. And the other thing that tells you this is true, the normally ruthless Stanton, not only does he not punish the bodyguard, why doesn't he
Yeah.
punish the sergeant? He's just
Yeah.
violated a standing military order. In violation of orders, he let the president's assassins escape. Why wasn't he punished? Why weren't his sergeant's stripes stripped off his uniform for doing this? But nothing happens to the guy. Stanton lets him off the hook.
I mean, the guy just holding the horse gets in trouble and gets, hard labor down on some island prison camp. And this guy, nothing happens to him.
Nothing happens to him at all. And then there's the fact that Stanton left one road unpatrolled, and that's the road
Yeah.
Booth took. And we'll talk about that. I just want to quote Eisenschimmel in 1937. He said this, quote, "Only one hole was left on the network that Stanton spun around the nation's capital. This was the road that pointed straight south from Washington to Port Tobacco. It was the road Booth was most likely to use, for it led to the Confederacy, the only place where the assassin could hope to find protection. And all the wires sent out from the War Department during the night of April the 14th, this route was not mentioned once. No precautions were taken to guard it. The only road that Stanton failed to bar was the one that Booth used to escape from Washington, and there never should have been the slightest doubt that would use it," end quote. Now, let me mention why Stanton should have known Booth can take that road. Stanton had spies in Booth's circle. They knew all about the kidnapping plot. Now, we know about this. We know that one of the spies was Louis Weichman. He was a roommate of John Surratt, who was in on the kidnapping plot. And while this Surratt's roommate, he was actually working in the War Department and reporting all about the kidnapping plot to his supervisor, Captain Daniel Gleason. Gleason, in his memoir published in 1911, said that this was being passed up the ranks to Stanton. Now, he never met with Stanton. He wasn't that high ranking, but he had no doubts that Stanton knew. And as Secretary of War, with 2,000 personal spies working for him, you've got to understand he must have known about a plot to kidnap the president, something that important. Now, when Daniel Gleason, learned about the assassination, he rushed to the War Department. He says, "I know which way they're going. They're going to take the same road that we're going to use for the kidnapping. Give me a squad of soldiers. I'll chase them down that road." They said, no, you stay in the War Department. You'll do us more good here in Washington." And so Stanton did know. I mean, we can't prove it because we don't have it in his handwriting, but from what Gleason has told us, he did know about the kidnapping plot, and it was obvious that Booth was going to use that road, but he did nothing to stop Booth. It was the one road that he left open.
I mean,
Too much of a coincidence. I'm sorry. I can believe in coincidences, but not too many.
right.
But
and who benefits from
right,
this again?
right. It's not the South.
Yeah.
The South does not benefit. The South is going to have a reconstruction made even more merciless by being blamed for the assassination.
Yeah,
now,
and Stanton obviously is going to be gaining, and the radical Republicans. I mean, the people in Lincoln's own party.
Yeah, they get to keep their power. The deep state keeps its congressmen in office, and they're the controlling party. Now, the other thing is about Booth's eventual death. And what's interesting is that there were thousands of soldiers and detectives in Virginia looking for Booth. And Colonel James O'Brien, who eventually won a Congressional Medal of Honor, medal for valor during the Civil War, he reported to the War Department that he was very close to getting Booth, but he's told to stay where you are. And I've got a quote from a very sarcastic remark about the Honorable Secretary of War. Stanton organizes a special detachment in Washington, costs an extra day's time. He could have had anybody capture Booth, but instead he wants a special detachment with special officers in charge. So technically, usually this detachment is 26 enlisted men under the command of Lieutenant Edward Doherty, but Stanton attached two special men to it. One was Luther Baker. Luther Baker was a cousin of Lafayette Baker, head of the Secret Service, and he's in the Secret Service. And the other man was Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger, who's also in the Secret Service. And Conger was not in active duty, but because he was a lieutenant colonel, that gave him nominal command of the force. Now, what's really, this is one thing that nobody ever asked, and I don't know why they don't ask it, but when they get to the barn where Harold and Booth are staying, Harold surrenders. Now, they've got this guy outnumbered almost 30-1. He's crippled from a broken leg. And yet they're too timid and terrified to just burst through the door and rush the guy. I mean, come on now. You know what kind of odds Civil War soldiers face. Pickett's Charge, Cold Harbor, Fredericksburg. Men would march towards certain death with terrible odds, a very high likelihood they would be killed. And yet 30 men are afraid of this one crippled man in the barn. They can't rush him. So Doherty, the normal commander, said, let's wait till the morning. But the man in charge, Conger, says, no, let's smoke him out. Let's set it on fire. It's Conger who sets the barn on fire out of the sight of anyone. And then there's a pistol shot. Everybody saw it was a pistol shot that killed Booth. And the man who took credit was Sergeant Boston Corbett. But nobody saw Boston Corbett fire that shot. And he claimed he did it from divine providence. That was his first excuse. And when the trial took place, he said he did it because Booth was aiming at him. But that doesn't make any sense because Booth was shot from the side through his neck. He was not facing whoever shot him. Then Corbett changed it again. He said he was threatening somebody else. But actually, one of the sons of the farmer that owned that farm, his name was R.B. Garrett, was looking at Booth, said he was not aiming at anyone, just hobbling on his crutch. Lieutenant Baker said the same thing. I was looking at Booth. He wasn't aiming his gun at anyone. And here's what Lieutenant Baker said in his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee. He was not called to testify at the trial, which he was upset about. He said, quote, "I suppose at the time that Conger, the commander-in-chief, shot him. And I said, what on earth did you shoot him for? Said he, I did not shoot him. Then the idea flashed on my mind. If he did, it better not be known." So they didn't want Booth coming back. Booth knew too much. He knew his northern accomplices. He could have spilled the beans. They wanted him dead. And so Corbett, because he shot Booth against orders, was supposed to be court-martialed, right? But what happens? He comes back to Washington, supposed to have a court-martial. Here's what Stanton says. The rebel, meaning Booth, the rebel is dead. The patriot lives. He saved us excitement, delay, and expense. The patriot is released. End quote. He just ends the court-martial right there. Now, if there'd been a court-martial, there would have been a prosecutor, a defense. The weapon that killed Booth would have had to be produced. There'd been witnesses. The soldiers would have called to testify. By canceling the court-martial, he prevented an investigation of what really happened at that farm, at that barn. So Stanton just erased that like he erased so many other things.
Why did he originally, Stanton, say to bring him back alive?
I think that was for public effect. He had to say bring him back alive.
Okay.
But he wanted his own private detachment to get him because he did not want him brought alive.
Right.
I think that the outcome would have been much different. There's one thing that neither Booth nor Stanton anticipated. That was the broken leg.
Yeah. because they
Booth would
thought he
have
was
been,
gonna get
Booth was
away.
going to be long gone, but he was moving very slowly, and it changed the Stanton's criterion. Now,
So
let's
it
talk.
was originally he gets away far, far away. He's been our patsy. Be gone, Booth. You did your job, but because he was so slow, they needed to kill him to
Yeah,
silence him.
and this is what I believe now. There are theories that he lived on. There's 20
Yeah,
different theories on that. I don't actually support those theories, but I do say in my book I leave the door open on that. I feel the weight of evidence is he was the man in the barn, but
yeah.
I
Especially because he
understand what
was famous, you know. It's like when people say Jim Morrison became Rush Limbaugh or whatever. I mean, I'm not
or
sure if these
yeah,
things
yeah,
can
Elvis is
occur when
still
you're.
alive on a UFO, and Kennedy didn't stage his own assassination. Even they didn't say Lincoln staged his own assassination,
Because he was
but
famous before the shooting and then obviously after. So yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
agree that they just had to silence him.
Um, we should talk. Well, I'll talk briefly about the see. Okay, we still have a little time, I guess. The trial itself, it's important to understand that the 8 convicted were denied the constitutional right to a
Yeah.
trial by jury. They were treated as if this was a court martial, even though they were all civilians. They were tried by 9 military judges. Most have had no court experience, no legal experience. They're all handpicked by Stanton. And whereas a jury, you need a unanimous verdict. For a military trial, you only needed 5 out of 9 votes for guilty conviction and 6 out of 9 for the death penalty. Um, all kinds of perjury. I won't go down. Were used during the trial. It was ridiculous. But the
People
most
paid to perjure.
yeah, as much as
Yeah.
several $1,000s. And this was brought up again by a House committee that was investigating claims of perjury, and they were trying to disprove it, but ended up proving it. That what they didn't mean to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one of the witnesses named Merrill or Merritt, I think it was Merritt, just broke down and admitted he lied at the trial. But
Yeah, and just the disappearance of evidence, you would think that would be a mistrial like in a civil suit, just that on top of the changing stories. David Harold, didn't his confession like that went away, you
yeah,
know?
David Harold wrote out a long written confession. It took him more than one day to write.
Yeah,
He could only write it in the courtroom because in the prison cell he had to wear the hood over his
right.
head. But he wrote it out, and then that vanished. Nobody's ever seen it
Yeah.
since. And
Booth's
George
diary?
at hmm?
Didn't Booth's diary go missing too?
Yeah, well, this is the most important thing is that Conger, who some of us suspect is the man who shot Booth,
Mm.
he didn't wait for Booth to die. He wanted to get that diary right to Stanton. So
Yeah,
he took it straight to Stanton, and Lafayette Baker, as head of the Secret Service, leafed through it, and Eckert saw it, and Holt, the chief prosecutor, saw it, but they didn't reveal it. Now, what was introduced at the trial as evidence found on Booth was his knife, pistols, belt holster, file, pocket compass, spur, tobacco pipe, carbon, cartridge, and bills of exchange, notes from a bank. But the diary was not introduced as evidence. And the only reason we know that that diary even existed is because Stanton had a break with the head of the Secret Service, Lafayette Baker. So Baker went rogue. He wrote
yeah,
his own book called The History of the Secret Service. In that book, revealed that Booth had a diary, and even having leafed through it, he mentioned passages which you won't find now in Booth's diary because it's been tampered with extensively. But now the public was shocked. Congress was shocked, and they subpoenaed the diary. Um, and I just want to quote what Congressman Benjamin Butler. He's not one of my favorite people, but he did make very telling remarks about this diary. He said, quote, "Now, what I want to know is this. It was a good judgment on the part of the gentleman prosecuting the assassins to put in evidence that tobacco pipe, spur, and compass found in Booth's pocket. Why not that diary in his own handwriting
yeah,
in the same pocket put in evidence? Because that evidence from that diary could have cleared people." Now, I need to mention that the man who attacked Secretary of State Seward, Lewis Powell, told detectives and his attorney there was no plot to murder until that evening, the evening of the assassination. This was separately confirmed by George Atzerodt, accused of trying to kill Vice President Johnson says there's no plot until 8 o'clock that evening. Now they could have been colluding because they're in solitary confinement. They can't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And Booth's diary says the same thing. The little bit we have, little fragment we have left says April the 14th until today, nothing was even thought of sacrificing to our country's wrongs. For 6 months, we'd worked to capture, meaning to kidnap, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done. If that had been introduced in court, people could have been let off the hooks. For example, Booth had a accomplice in the kidnapping plot named Sam Arnold. Sam Arnold dropped out of the kidnapping plot. He hadn't been in Washington for 2 weeks. He hadn't spoken to Booth in 2 weeks. He was down in Fort Monroe, Virginia, 180 miles away. No way he could have known about a murder plot that originated in Washington. That's on the day of the 14th. He wasn't anywhere around, but he was sentenced to life in prison at Dry Tortugas, west of Key West. I didn't know there was an island west of Key West until I read this book. They put him as far away as they could.
Yeah.
If they couldn't hang him, they put him as far away as they could. They all went to Dry Tortugas. Now, same thing with Dr. Mudd. He was down at his farm in Maryland. Did the assassination. No way he could have known about a plot to murder Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And nobody would have even heard of Dr. Mudd if Booth didn't break his leg. But he got a life sentence too at Dry Tortugas, which Andrew Johnson thankfully commuted. Now, but the other thing about the diary is after subpoenaed by Congress, it was mutilated. And here's what Congressman Butler said after they received the diary. That diary is now produced, has 18 pages cut out, the pages prior to the time when Abraham Lincoln was massacred, although the edges show they'd been written all over. Who spoliated that book? Who caused an innocent woman to be hung? Now, 110 years later, the FBI forensic laboratory examined John Wilkes Booth's diary. They were asked to do this by the National Park Service. There are a couple of reasons. One was the diary was falling apart and they wanted it to be examined before it was useless. The other reason was that some scholars thought there was secret handwriting in the diary, which there wasn't. But what the FBI did find, and I quote the FBI's report, which is in my book, and you can find it online, quote, in total there are 43 full sheets, 86 pages, because there's two pages to a sheet, 86 pages missing from the diary, more than Congress realized. The FBI found out that the 27 pages immediately preceding the assassination were missing, and 25 of those pages, you could still see the stubs. And on those stubs, you could still see little fragments of Booth's handwriting, a punctuation mark, a letter. And the FBI said that if these pages were later found, this would assist in any future examination relating to these pages. So the FBI confirmed in their forensic laboratory that it was tampered with. In fact, the pages after the assassination were removed from the diary, and some of the pages were glued back in, just the ones that Stanton wanted people to see. And that's what you'll see online when you look at Booth's diary. There are certain pages no one was supposed to look at. And the FBI said they were rebound into the diary and glued. How would now modern manuscript historians say Booth did it himself? No. He's in the swamp. There's no way he can remove pages from his diary and glue them back in. That has to be done in the War Department. You know, just use common logic. Stanton has kept the diary a secret for 2 years. That's because he has something to hide. The same man who has something to hide about the diary's existence is going to be the one who hides the pages he now doesn't want to be seen. You can be sure he was sorry he didn't destroy that diary in the first place, but his cover was blown by Lafayette Baker. By the way, Lafayette Baker, who exposed the diary's existence, he died at the age of 41 in 1868. His physician said he had all the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, but since he couldn't figure out how somebody could have poisoned them, he wrote meningitis on the death certificate. But a lot of people think that it just didn't pay to double cross Secretary of War Stanton. Now, the evidence against Stanton is incredibly great, and it was proven by Otto Ehrenschimel in 1937. It was proven again on the NBC television special made in 1971. It aired on Lincoln's birthday. Millions of people had to have seen that, because remember, 1971, over 95% of all homes owned a television set, and there's no smartphones or laptops to look at. So people did tune in their TV, and only 3 networks back then, CBS, NBC, and ABC. So millions of people must have seen the special about how Stanton and the War Department killed Lincoln, and you can be sure that was water cooler conversation the next day. But that was still more than 50 years ago. Since then, it's all been forgotten about, and modern and mainstream historians, I talk about some of them in my book, have gone out of their way to smear Otto Eisenschmidt and say he was just a wild conspiracy theorist, despite all the archival research, the amazing research. He talked to Luther Baker's son, Luther Baker, this lieutenant who was part of the detachment that caught Booth. There was a slave girl, young slave girl who belonged to Samuel Cox, who let Booth stay in his pine thicket for a few days while the Union cavalry was going past. Eisenschmidt actually sought out that slave girl and talked to her. Now, that's first-class historical research. Remember, in 1937, it's very hard to find people. There's no online white pages where you can just look up somebody and find out where they live now. He had to do all kinds of legwork. He was a great scholar, but they smear him now and just say, oh, his theory was bizarre and ridiculous. And that's something that kind of animated me to finish this book, because when I saw the smear, it's right along with taking down the statue of your ancestor, 8 Bear Hill. They're destroying history. And part of that history is what really happened to Abraham Lincoln. And that's why I decided it's time to write this book and bring back to this generation the truth about the Lincoln assassination. I know there have been other conspiracy books, but and I obviously haven't read all the books about Lincoln. There are thousands of books about Lincoln.
Too many.
But the two that struck me the most were Otto Eisenschmidt, 1937, and my good friend Don Thomas, whose ancestors fought defending the Richmond. By the way, in case anyone thinks I've got an axe to grind for the Confederacy, I'm a Northerner. I'm a Yankee. I'm from Massachusetts, which, by the way, is probably about the bottom of the list of states in the Union for a lot of reasons that I won't go into. I'm already losing a lot of book sales up here. I know, but
you are not a Yankee, though. Let me say, I'm sure I probably said this. You're a Northerner. There's a difference.
Well, Don told me, not all Yankees are liars. I said, you're right, Don. Only 90%. Only 90% are liars. But Otto Eisenschmidt, by the way, his father was an officer in the Union Army, so he didn't have any axe to grind for the Confederates. He's not doing this to uphold Dixie. He's doing this because after the truth,
right?
And that's what we're pursuing here, and that's what you're doing on your thing. That's actually also, by the way, what led us to Eastern Orthodoxy, which, by the way, was almost not true, but almost non-existent at the time of the Civil War, and it was around, but it was not in something that most Americans belong to. It's only through recent years in finding out that the solidarity that the Orthodox Church still retains with the original form of worship that Christians had. And that's what the last book I had called Missing Saints, Missing Miracles was about, the last time you and I spoke 2 years ago. But anyway, I don't want to get too far off the track of the Lincoln assassination.
No, and it's not just a pursuit of truth. You can be from anywhere and be a truth seeker. But this book, like I said at the very beginning, it's more relevant today than ever, I think, because of not only the assassination attempt on Trump, but lawfarism is everywhere. Well, that's what happened when the constitutional rights were denied to the 8 people tried in a military tribunal.
Right.
They're
like January the 6th. Yeah.
They're not offered counsel till after they're arraigned. They couldn't talk to each other, just their horrible treatment. And then just the deep state implications, Stanton and, the military, the congressional conspirators, and then what I think is the main point of the War of Northern Aggression is mercantilism, would be industrial capitalism, which is what the North wanted to impose upon the country at large. And they could do that through sharecropping. They would still have King Cotton. They just wouldn't have to deal with the South as a political force anymore.
Very, very good point. Very good point.
And these are the same forces that fight the wars today, which is not just domestic policy, but geopolitical policy. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing.
Right. And I just want to point out for those who think that the North had the moral high ground and all of this, a few points. Number one, it was the Northern ships that brought the slaves over to um, the South anyway. And a lot of them from my own state of Massachusetts, Boston Prominence were making huge money off the slave trade until that was abolished. Also, the North had its own form of slavery. And what I mean by that is in those factories, it was basically the South was agricultural and the North was industrial. Well, in those factories, they were using children as virtual slave laborers, paying them nothing or next to nothing for their work. The working conditions were horrible. That was a form of slavery in itself. And let's not forget, for people who think was all about these people so concerned about freedom, they passed the Habeas Suspension Corpus Act, and thousands upon thousands of people were thrown in prison with no due process, just like the January 6 people, whose only crime was being somewhere in the vicinity of the so-called insurrection. Same thing was happening back then for people who think things haven't changed. And if people think that the Lincoln assassination is not relevant, believe me, the deep state thinks it is, because the deep state still maintains the fictions about the Korean War, Pearl Harbor, Siege of Lusitania, Spanish-American War, Civil War. They pay tribute to their own icons who have served them over the centuries. They maintain historical fictions just as they do about things today like climate change and other things they're using to oppress us. So history is very important to have that big picture.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And thank you for putting a, chink in the armor of the false narrative. And the book is fabulous. Here it is. And it, like I said early on, it is a really easy read. I'm probably going to read it a second time. And I'm not a second book kind of reading kind of gal, but it is phenomenal because I feel like I missed some things and I want to make sure I get it all. But you just even asking the question, James, I'm glad you're out there asking important questions and connecting dots. So thank you so much for doing this. And I'm glad it's in a book that, won't be ignored like a very long blog post.
Right. Well, tell you one book that I did read two times back in the 1990s was Jefferson Davis's Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. I read it twice, and that is not a short book. That is
Yeah.
very long. But what I learned was that, and I read Lincoln's writings and Jefferson Davis's writings. Davis was a constitutional scholar.
Mhm.
He read not just the Constitution, which Lincoln almost never referred to in his writings, but he read all of the ratifying conventions of the Union that was originally federal government that was formed, all the ratifying conventions, and there were states that specifically joined with a reservation they could pull out anytime. New York,
Yeah.
he put it out, and when they joined the Union, they said we can leave anytime we want to. And in my own state of Massachusetts, which twice threatened to secede from the Union, you know what the vote was to join the Union? 182 to 168. Now, there were just 8 votes shy of rejecting joining the Union. I'm sure they would have eventually. But the point I made in Southern Partisan Magazine, this is almost 30 years ago, supposing in 1790, 2 years later after that vote, Massachusetts said, you know what? We, Massachusetts folks decide we don't like the Union, we're going to pull out. Can you imagine George Washington saying, you know what, I hereby declare that the people of Massachusetts are guilty of treason against the federal government,
Yeah.
and hereby command all the other states to form armies to invade Massachusetts, and I'm ordering the Navy to blockade Boston Harbor, and when Boston is captured, the city shall be burned to the ground, and the crops in Massachusetts, the ones that we don't steal, we're going to burn and let the
Right.
people starve. Do you think George Washington would have done that? Well, what changed between 1790 and 1860? Nothing changed, except that Lincoln had introduced this new idea that once you're in the Union, you're always in the Union and you can't leave. But if any state thought they were going to be brutally punished for leaving the Union, they never would have joined back in the days of George Washington. Not one state would ever have joined if they knew there was going to be an Abraham Lincoln who was going to invade them and destroy their infrastructure because they decided to maintain the original conditions by which they joined the Union, which was that they could leave when they wanted to. Many of the states did, not all of them, but many of them put that specific disclaimer in there. So there's a lot to be said about the rights and wrongs of the Civil War that are not being said any longer.
And it's, this is why people are called names for discussing it, because the pattern for American politics that was set from, I guess the 1850s through the 1870s, that made the federal government the center of power for us all.
Mhm.
Um, and the arbiter of everything that is good. We have to fix everything and go spread democracy around the
Yeah,
globe.
and
This is where it comes from, y'all. So
throw out the 10th Amendment, throw out the 10th Amendment. And Jefferson Davis, in his book, Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, warned, he says, the people of America think they're freeing slaves, but actually they're going to make themselves all slaves. By the way, there's one last thing I got to tell you.
yeah.
I figured it out. The South definitely should have won the war. I've done the math, and based on the number of Yankees that Josie Wales killed every day, I do the math. By 1865, every Union soldier should have been dead by then. So I just can't figure out how the South lost. I just never. I just still stumps me.
Well, it was a long 4 years, and the fact they held on that long is truly phenomenal. But I'll end this with actually a Jefferson Davis quote. It's one of my favorites.
Oh,
Truth crushed to the earth is truth still, and like a seed will rise again. It may not
oh,
be in our lifetime, whatever the lies happen to be, but in eternity, every lie will be dispelled and all truth will embrace us. So I just love talking to truth seekers and people who are willing to push against the status quo narrative,
mhm.
because overall, the status quo narrative hates us and wants us dead. So thank you, James.
Right. Thank you. And I'd like to think that you and I are maybe at least small twigs on the tree
Yeah.
of the kernel of truth that Jefferson Davis was talking about. Um, and ultimately, we know, and I quote some people at the end of my book from that era, from the
Mhm.
Lincoln assassination, talking about there will be a day of judgment, and
Yep.
no matter how many lies you tell, you're not going to be able to die before the law of God. I'm basically quoting Samuel Arnold, one of the accused eight, but there are other quotes in there as well.
Yeah. Well, amen to that, James. Thank you so much for reaching out to me and sending me the book. I hope that everybody buys it, and God bless you for all that you do, and keep on fighting the good fight, sir.
Oh, well, thank you, and God bless you. You can't do better than an Orthodox Christian who's also a Dixie girl. I'm just so delighted to be on with you. I thank you. It's a joy. This is the kind of a podcast. It's truly a joy to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you, James. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.